What if I told you that the woman who saved dozens of lives was also the mother of a killer? It was supposed to be a love story, not the kind you read in fairy tales or see on Valentine's Day cards, but one written late in life after the heartbreaks, after the losses, after the years of growing old alone under the merciless Arizona sun. Nadine Jackson was 64 years old, a widow, a mother of 5, and for most of her adult life, she had played by the rules. But rules, as Nadine would soon discover, don't protect you from the monsters who hunt in plain sight. She hadn't always been alone, but Nadine had always known loneliness. Even when Robert, her late husband, was alive, there had been a kind of quiet distance between them, a marriage built more on duty than desire, more on routine than romance. Picture this: a woman sitting at her kitchen table every morning for 30 years, pouring coffee for a man who read the sports section instead of looking at her face. Robert was a good man, everyone said so, dependable and disciplined, a civil engineer for the city of Phoenix who came home at 6 p.m. sharp, read the paper in his faded recliner, and rarely spoke about feelings. He provided, he protected, but he never really saw her. Not the way a woman dreams of being seen. Can you imagine living with someone for 3 decades and still feeling invisible? In the early years, she tried. Oh, how she tried. Candlelit dinners that he came home too late for. The food growing cold on bone china that had been a wedding gift. Weekend getaways to Sedona that turned into silent drives through red rock canyons, the radio filling the space where conversation should have been. After their 5th child was born, something in Nadine simply gave up. She stopped waiting for him to notice the new dress she'd bought with her grocery money. Stopped hoping he'd comment on the haircut that took 3 hours at the salon. Stopped listening for footsteps that might quicken with anticipation instead of trudging with exhaustion. Here's what nobody tells you about a loveless marriage. It doesn't kill you all at once. It kills you slowly, one forgotten anniversary at a time. When Robert was diagnosed with cancer at 58, Nadine became his nurse, his advocate, his everything. She drove him to every appointment at Banner Medical Center, her hands steady on the wheel while her heart crumbled with each new prognosis. She held his hand through every chemo session, whispering encouragement while her own dreams withered in the sterile hospital air. She whispered prayers over his sleeping form every night, burying her own fears so deep she forgot they existed. She never told anyone, not her children, not her closest friend, how lonely she felt, even with a dying man sharing her bed. Have you ever felt alone in a room full of people who love you? That was Nadine's life. The day they buried Robert, Nadine stood at his graveside in a black dress that hung loose on her shrinking frame. She was surrounded by children and grandchildren and church members who hugged her and promised she wouldn't be alone. Their words felt like echoes in a canyon, well-meaning but hollow. But when the last sympathy card stopped coming and the neighbors went back to their own lives, Nadine discovered what true loneliness felt like. It was different from the loneliness she'd felt in her marriage. That had been quiet, familiar, like background noise you learn to ignore. This was sharp and immediate and suffocating, the kind of loneliness that made you understand why people did desperate things. And desperation, as we'll see, makes you vulnerable to predators who hunt in plain sight. For 7 years, she filled her days with routine. Book club on Tuesdays where they dissected romance novels she'd never lived. Church on Sundays where she sat in the same pew, 3rd row from the front, left side. Family dinners every other weekend when her scattered children could make it. Conversations that felt more like obligations than connections. She learned to cook for one, portioning leftover casseroles into plastic containers that filled her freezer like frozen promises of tomorrow. She learned to sleep in the center of a king-sized bed, arms spread wide in a space that had once felt too small for 2. She learned to make decisions without consulting anyone, what to watch on TV, when to go to bed, whether to buy the good coffee or the store brand. She thought she had made peace with solitude. But solitude, as Nadine would soon discover, makes you vulnerable to predators who study loneliness like a science.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
And then came the letter that would change everything and destroy her family. It arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, mixed in with the usual bills and charity appeals that filled her mailbox like autumn leaves. Plain white envelope, no return address, her name typed on a label with the precision of someone who didn't want their handwriting recognized. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message that would save her life and cost her everything she loved. "Mrs. Jackson, my name is Eleanor Winters. You don't know me, but I believe we share something in common. A man named Oliver Hayes. I think he's targeting you next. Please call me. We need to talk." Nadine's hands trembled as she read the words again. Oliver Hayes? She'd never heard that name before. But something in her chest, a mother's instinct perhaps, told her this letter wasn't a prank. What Nadine didn't know was that this letter would save her life and destroy her family. 6 months later, she would be standing over a grave she'd helped dig. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. What would you do if someone offered you a second chance at love when you thought your story was over? The cruise had been Keely's idea, a 70th birthday gift, she'd said, though Nadine's birthday was still 2 months away. "Mom, you need to get out there and live a little. Dad wouldn't want you sitting in that house forever, becoming one of those old ladies who talks to her cats." Nadine didn't have cats. She'd thought about getting one after Robert died, but cats seemed like admitting defeat, like accepting that this was it, that her story was over except for the slow fade to credits. But the truth behind Keely's generosity was more complicated, tinged with the guilt that comes from watching your mother disappear in slow motion. Keely had been worried about Nadine for months. The way her mother had started talking to herself while doing dishes, carrying on full conversations with someone who wasn't there. The way she'd begun leaving lights on all over the house at night, as if darkness itself was something to be afraid of. The way she'd stopped bothering with lipstick or anything that suggested she still cared about being seen. Sometimes love looks like a Mediterranean cruise. Sometimes it looks like pushing someone toward danger to save them from themselves. Keely thought a cruise would help her mother remember how to be alive. She had no idea she was sending her mother directly into the arms of a killer. The Mediterranean cruise ship was like a floating city, full of silver-haired couples holding hands and groups of laughing women her age discovering their independence. Nadine felt out of place at first, awkward in the sundresses Keely had bought her from Nordstrom, uncertain about dining alone in restaurants with white tablecloths and servers who called her madam like she was someone important. That's where she met Oliver. And this is where our story really begins, with a mojito and a lie wrapped in the most beautiful smile Nadine had seen in 20 years. Oliver Hayes was 26, tall and lean with dark hair that caught the Mediterranean sun like silk threads. He had the kind of smile that made you feel like the most interesting person in the room, and hands that knew exactly how to touch your arm when he laughed at your jokes. He was working the cruise as a guest relations coordinator, leading wine tastings where he'd tell stories about vineyards he'd never visited, organizing shore excursions to places he'd researched but never loved. He had gentle hands and a way of listening that made Nadine feel like every word she spoke was precious. When she talked about her book club, he leaned in like she was discussing philosophy. When she mentioned her garden back in Phoenix, he asked questions that made her feel like an expert on desert roses. What she didn't notice was how his eyes never quite matched his smile, or how he always seemed to know exactly what to say, or how he'd studied her for 2 weeks before making his approach. "You have the most peaceful eyes," he told her on the third night, as they stood on the deck watching the sun melt into the Mediterranean like honey into tea. The air smelled of salt and possibility, and Nadine felt something she'd forgotten she was capable of feeling: hope. "There's wisdom there," Oliver continued, his voice low and intimate. "And kindness. That's rare these days." Nadine laughed, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in years. It felt rusty, uncertain, like a skill she'd forgotten how to use. "You're just being nice to an old lady." "Old?" Oliver stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne mixed with sea salt and something indefinable that might have been danger if she'd been paying attention. "Lady, you're just getting started. You've got decades of living left to do." And for the first time in 7 years, Nadine felt like someone was really seeing her. But here's what Nadine didn't know, what she couldn't have known. Oliver had spent 2 weeks studying her before making his approach. He knew about her morning routine. Coffee at 7 a.m. sharp, always black, always in the same deck chair. He knew she was traveling alone, that she kept her purse clutched tight to her body, like someone unaccustomed to having things worth stealing. He knew she was recently widowed because she still wore her wedding ring, twisted it when she was nervous, looked at it like a lifeline to a past that was slipping away. He knew about Robert's life insurance policy because he'd overheard her phone call with her daughter about paying off the house. He knew about the inheritance because he'd seen her hesitate before ordering wine, calculating costs like someone with money but not comfort with spending it. Oliver Hayes was a hunter, and Nadine Jackson was exactly the prey he'd been tracking. He knew exactly which buttons to push, How do you tell your children that you've found love when they've spent years watching you give up on life? By the time the cruise ended, Nadine felt like she was walking on air, her feet barely touching the ground as she navigated the airport back to Phoenix. Oliver had requested a transfer to the Los Angeles office of the cruise line, he said. He wanted to see her again, to take her to dinner on solid ground, to show her that life could still hold surprises. "I've been thinking about what you said," he'd whispered as they said goodbye at the Barcelona port, his lips close enough to her ear that she could feel his breath. About starting over, about it never being too late for happiness. Nadine had felt tears spring to her eyes, not sad tears, but the kind that come when someone hands you back a piece of yourself you thought was lost forever. But back home in Phoenix, someone else was watching. Someone who'd noticed the changes in his mother and didn't like what he saw. When Nadine returned home to Phoenix, she was a different woman. She bought new clothes, not from the discount rack at Target where she'd shopped for years, but from the boutiques in Scottsdale where the saleswomen called her honey and meant it. She started wearing lipstick again, the deep red shade Robert had always said was too much for a woman her age. She even got her hair styled at a posh salon instead of the local place that had been cutting it the same way for 20 years. Her children noticed the change immediately, gathering around her kitchen table like a tribunal of concerned love. Picture this scene, a mother glowing with happiness, surrounded by children who can only see the danger she's blind to. "Mom's glowing," her youngest son Damon said during one of their family dinners, but his voice carried a note of concern that the others missed. Damon had always been the most protective of Nadine's children, the one who called every Sunday without fail, the one who still felt responsible for his mother's happiness, even though he had his own security company to run and his own family to protect. Damon had also inherited his father's suspicious nature and his grandfather's quick temper, a dangerous combination when mixed with protective love. "What you been up to then?" he asked, watching his mother's face carefully, noting how her eyes sparkled when she talked about her trip, how her hands moved more gracefully, how she seemed to take up more space in her own kitchen. Nadine blushed like a teenager caught passing notes in class. "I met someone on the cruise." The silence that followed was deafening. Keely set down her fork with a clink that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. You could have heard a pin drop in that kitchen, could have counted heartbeats in the space between her words and their reactions. "Met someone. Like a friend. Like a man," Nadine said, lifting her chin slightly in a gesture her children recognized from their childhoods, the look that meant she'd made up her mind and God help anyone who tried to change it. "His name is Oliver Hayes, and he's wonderful." And that's when the interrogation began. The questions came rapid fire then, like bullets from a machine gun. How old was he? What did he do? Where was he from? Did he have children? Ex-wives? A criminal record? Had she done a background check? Nadine answered what she could, deflected what she couldn't, and held tight to the joy that her children's concerns couldn't quite steal. But there was one question none of them thought to ask. How had Oliver known exactly which cruise she'd be on? And there was one person in the room who was already planning to find out. What would you do if you discovered your mother was in love with a lie? Damon watched his mother's face as she talked about Oliver Hayes, and something cold settled in his stomach like a stone in dark water. He'd seen that look before, on women who'd been targeted by con artists, on elderly relatives who'd fallen for romance scams, on victims who couldn't see the predator because they were too desperate for the prey to be real. His mother looked happy, yes, but she also looked desperate. And desperate people, Damon knew from his years in security work, made easy targets. That night, Damon made the first of many decisions that would destroy everything. He hired a private investigator.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
But before we get to that, let me paint you a picture of love in action. Oliver kept his word. Within a month, he was driving up from California every weekend, bringing flowers that weren't from grocery stores and wine with names Nadine couldn't pronounce. He fixed the loose step on her front porch, the one that had been wobbling for 2 years, the one her children kept promising to repair. He helped her plant new desert roses in the garden, getting his hands dirty in her soil like he planned to stay forever. He sat with her on the porch swing Robert had built decades ago, holding her hand like she was made of something precious. And when the Arizona sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that tourists pay thousands to see, Oliver would whisper things in her ear that made her feel like a woman instead of just someone's mother, someone's widow, someone's burden. But someone was watching from across the street, someone who'd been watching for weeks. When Oliver proposed on Boxing Day, kneeling beside the tree Nadine had decorated with ornaments collected over 40 years of marriage and motherhood, she said yes without hesitation. The ring was simple, elegant, exactly what she would have chosen for herself if she dared to dream that big. "We're not getting any younger," he said, slipping the diamond onto her finger with hands that trembled just enough to seem genuine. "Why wait when we could be happy now?" The ring was beautiful. It was also exactly like the ones he'd given to 4 other women. The wedding was planned for Valentine's Day. Intimate, just immediate family, and a few close friends in Nadine's backyard under the mesquite tree that had shaded her children's playground, witnessed their first steps, sheltered decades of birthday parties and barbecues, and ordinary moments that, in hindsight, felt golden. But her children's enthusiasm was lukewarm at best, tinged with the kind of worry that comes from watching someone you love walk toward a cliff with their eyes closed. "Mom, don't you think this is moving rather fast?" Keely asked during one of their shopping trips for a wedding dress. They were standing in the bridal section of Nordstrom, surrounded by white dresses that seemed to mock the idea of a 64-year-old bride. Nadine caught her reflection in the 3-way mirror, gray hair, lined face, body that had carried 5 children and 64 years of living. And for a moment, she saw herself through her daughter's eyes, a foolish old woman playing dress-up in someone else's dream. "You've only known him 8 months, Keely continued, her voice gentle but insistent. "I knew your father for 3 years before we married," Nadine replied, her voice sharper than usual, defensive in the way that suggested she'd asked herself the same question in the dark hours before dawn. "And I spent 30 years wondering if he really loved me. Oliver tells me he loves me every day. I feel it every time he looks at me. At my age, love, time is precious." But it was Damon who voiced what they were all thinking, and his words would prove more prophetic than anyone could have imagined. "Mom, what do you really know about this guy?" Damon's voice cut through the pretense like a knife through silk. "Have you Googled him? Checked his references? I mean, he's 38 years younger than you. He's got no family to speak of, no real job history, and now he's moving in with a woman who owns her house outright and has Dad's pension in the bank." Nadine's face went cold, the kind of cold that comes when someone voices your deepest fears out loud. "Are you suggesting Oliver is after my money?" "I'm suggesting you be careful, Mom. That's all." But what Damon was really suggesting was something far more sinister, and he was planning to prove it. The conversation ended with hurt feelings and raised voices, and by the time the wedding day arrived, the family tensions were thick enough to cut with a knife. But Nadine was radiant in her ivory dress, and Oliver was attentive and charming, calling her my beautiful bride, and promising to love and cherish her for all the days of his life. As Oliver slipped the ring onto Nadine's finger under the mesquite tree, Damon stood in the back of the small crowd and wondered if he was watching his mother's wedding or her death sentence. What would you do if you discovered that the man your mother married was a professional killer? This is where our story takes a turn into darkness, where the fairy tale becomes a nightmare, where love reveals its most dangerous face. Damon didn't have much to go on at first, just a gut feeling that wouldn't let him sleep, and a private investigator named Elizabeth Rogers who specialized in domestic cases. But sometimes all it takes is one crack to shatter the whole illusion. They started by searching Oliver's name online, Oliver Hayes. The results were surprisingly sparse for someone claiming to have worked cruise ships across the Mediterranean for 15 years. No high school records, no college alumni pages, no extensive work history beyond basic employment verification. It was like he'd materialized fully formed at age 18, with no past worth documenting. Odd for someone who claimed to have stories about every port from Barcelona to Istanbul. Digging deeper, Rogers cross-referenced Oliver's phone number with online databases. That's when the first red flag popped up like a warning flare in the darkness. The number was previously registered under a completely different name, Ethan Moore. A name tied to 2 fraud cases in Alabama and Mississippi, cases that had been dropped when the defendant vanished before trial. It snowballed from there, like an avalanche of lies tumbling down a mountain of deception. Over the next week, Rogers uncovered 3 aliases: Oliver Hayes, Ethan Moore, and a third, Jacob Miller, all linked to a string of relationships with older women, all of whom had filed complaints ranging from emotional abuse to financial theft to something much worse. None of the cases had stuck. Oliver had always vanished before charges were filed, leaving behind only broken hearts and empty bank accounts. Oliver, or Ethan or Jacob, depending on who you asked, wasn't just a smooth-talking cruise coordinator with a charming smile. He was a ghost with a long trail of broken hearts, missing money, and dead bodies behind him. Rogers began tracing each alias, each town, each woman. It was like following a string of lights that only illuminated after they'd been snuffed out, a trail of destruction that stretched across half the country. One woman, a 58-year-old retired teacher from Mobile, Alabama, had met Ethan Moore on a cruise to Cozumel. He had wooed her with salsa dancing and deep conversations about second chances. She returned home engaged in $48,000 lighter. By the time she realized he'd emptied her accounts, he was gone. She died 6 months later, officially a heart attack, but her sister suspected it was a broken heart that killed her. Another woman, 63, from Jackson, Mississippi, met Jacob Miller through a dating app for seniors. He moved in within 3 weeks, claimed he was being sued by a former employer, and needed access to her funds just for a short time. When she started asking too many questions, he disappeared, taking her wedding ring, laptop, and car. She was found dead in her bathtub a week later, officially a slip and fall, but the bruises on her wrists suggested otherwise. None of the women had lived to press charges. They were too dead to be embarrassed. But one name stood out from the pattern of destruction: Karen Duvall, a 60-year-old widow from Savannah, Georgia. Unlike the others, she had survived her encounter with the monster, barely. Rogers found her through an online support group thread titled, "I Loved a Liar." Karen's story was different because she'd fought back, and her survival had cost her everything. He was calling himself Oliver Hayes back then too, Karen wrote in a private message to Rogers. Said he'd just moved from California. Ironic, huh? He told me he'd lost his parents in a car accident and had no family left. Said I reminded him of his mother's strength. I fell hard, fast, and when I found out he'd forged my signature to take out a second mortgage on my house, I called the cops. He was gone within 24 hours. But before he left, he made sure I knew what happens to women who cause him trouble. I survived, but I'll never be the same. Your mother's in danger. Real danger. Karen had filed a report, but again, Oliver had vanished before police could act. No fingerprints, no valid ID, nothing to hold on to. He was a master at reinvention, a chameleon in expensive clothes and deadly charm. And now Damon realized his mother was just the latest in a line of women who had become Oliver's next target, possibly his final target. But here's what made this case different, what elevated it from simple fraud to something far more sinister. Oliver had evolved. He was no longer content with just taking money and disappearing. He had developed a taste for something more permanent, more final. He had started killing his victims. But what Damon didn't know was that someone else had been watching Oliver too. Someone who'd been building a case for months. Someone who was about to turn his mother into bait. Detective Sarah Bennett of the Phoenix Police Department had been tracking Oliver Hayes for 2 years, ever since the third suspicious death in what the FBI had started calling the cruise ship killer case. The pattern was always the same: a lonely widow, a whirlwind romance, a quick marriage, and then a convenient death that left Oliver free to inherit everything and disappear. But this time, they had a secret weapon. They had Nadine. 6 months before Nadine met Oliver on that cruise, she had received a phone call that would change everything. A woman named Eleanor Winters, one of the FBI's victim advocates, had contacted her after Karen Duvall provided Nadine's name from Oliver's phone records. "Mrs. Jackson, I know this is going to sound crazy, but I believe your life may be in danger. Would you be willing to help us catch a killer?" The conversation that followed was like something out of a movie. FBI agents in her living room, recording equipment hidden in her jewelry box, a crash course in staying alive while pretending to fall in love with a man who'd already killed 5 women. Nadine had said yes without hesitation. Not because she was brave, but because she was tired of being a victim. For months, she'd played her part perfectly. Every conversation with Oliver was recorded. Every document he forged was cataloged. Every financial transaction was monitored. They had enough evidence to put him away for life, if they could keep him alive long enough to make it to trial. But what they hadn't counted on was Damon Jackson's protective instincts. What they hadn't counted on was a son who loved his mother enough to take matters into his own hands. "I'm not a killer. I'm not that kind of person." Damon had been repeating that to himself for 3 days straight, but the words felt hollow now, meaningless as dust in his mouth. Every time he saw his mother shuffle into the kitchen, shoulders slumped with grief she didn't deserve to carry, He felt like he was sinking deeper into the grave he'd dug with his own hands. Oliver was dead because of him, because of one blow too hard, too fast, too final. The worst part wasn't the fear of getting caught, though that terror lived in his chest like a wild animal clawing to get out. The worst part was the look in his mother's eyes, still hopeful, still believing, still whispering he'll come back, to an empty house that smelled like the cologne of a dead man. Damon knew he couldn't. Not anymore. Let me take you back to that night, the night that changed everything. The night love became murder. Damon had been drinking, not enough to lose control, but enough to silence the voice in his head that usually told him to walk away from trouble. He'd just left his sister Keely's house, where the conversation had turned into another shouting match about their mother's rapidly changing will. She's giving everything to that stranger, Damon. Everything. The house, the bank accounts, Dad's pension, all of it. Keely's words had hit him like physical blows. Their father had worked for 30 years to build a legacy for his children, and their mother was about to hand it all to a man they'd known for less than a year. But it wasn't about the money. It had never been about the money. It was about watching his mother, the woman who'd raised 5 children mostly on her own, who'd nursed their father through cancer without complaint, who'd never asked for anything in return, being systematically destroyed by a predator who'd studied her weaknesses like a textbook. On the way home, Damon drove past his mother's house and saw the porch lights still on. Oliver's rental car was parked in the driveway like it belonged there, like he belonged there, like he had every right to the space that should have been sacred to Robert Jackson's memory. Something in him snapped. He parked 2 houses down and walked back in the dark, using the key his mother had given him years ago for emergencies. He moved like a ghost through the house that had raised him, avoiding the creaky floorboard near the front hall, stepping around the dog toys that belonged to grandchildren who would inherit nothing if Oliver had his way. The house smelled like lavender and red wine, Nadine's usual nightcap, but underneath it was something else, something that didn't belong. Oliver's cologne, expensive and cloying, marking territory like an animal. From the hallway, Damon could hear faint music playing, jazz, something low and smooth that his mother had never listened to before Oliver. And then he heard voices, and his blood turned to ice water in his veins. Oliver was in the garage, standing by the deep freezer where Nadine kept leftovers and emergency supplies, talking on the phone in hushed tones that suggested secrets, lies, things that needed to be hidden. Damon couldn't hear everything, but one line came through clear as a bell, clear as a death sentence. "Yeah, once the house sells, we're out. She's all in, doesn't suspect a thing. Should be dead by next weekend. Dead by next weekend." The words hit Damon like a sledgehammer to the chest. His mother wasn't just being robbed, she was being murdered. Oliver wasn't planning to disappear with her money. He was planning to kill her and inherit everything legally. The grieving widower who'd tried so hard to save his beloved wife from whatever tragic accident would befall her. Damon stood frozen in the doorway, blood roaring in his ears like a freight train, watching the man who was planning to murder his mother. He stepped into the garage, and Oliver turned, startled but not scared. If anything, he looked amused, like he'd been expecting this confrontation, and was curious to see how it would play out. "You shouldn't be here," Oliver said, pocketing his phone with the casual confidence of a man who'd never met a problem he couldn't charm his way out of. "You want to talk to your mom? Do it in the morning." Damon's fists clenched at his sides. "What are you doing to her?" Oliver smiled. That same plastic smile Damon had hated from the first moment he'd seen it, the smile that had fooled his mother but had never fooled him. "Relax, man. I'm taking care of her better than you ever did." The words were like gasoline on a fire. "You're killing her," Damon said, his voice cracking with the weight of what he'd overheard. "You're literally planning to kill her." Oliver's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and reptilian underneath the charm. Then the smile returned, wider than before, more predatory. "It's not killing if she hands it over willingly. And they always do in the end. Lonely old women are so grateful for attention. They'll sign anything, believe anything, forgive anything." And then Oliver said the thing that sealed his fate. "Your mother's going to die happy, thinking someone finally loved her. That's more than most people get."
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
Damon didn't remember picking up the baseball bat. It was leaning against the workbench next to some tools, his father's tools, maintained with care by hands that would never hold them again. His real father, the one who'd built this house board by board, the one who'd taught Damon that some things were worth fighting for. The first swing was instinct. The second was fury. The third, he barely remembered. When Oliver hit the ground, there was silence. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just the quietest, most terrifying silence Damon had ever heard. The kind of silence that follows thunder, when you're waiting to see if the lightning will strike again. He stood there staring at the man crumpled on the garage floor, breathing heavily, hands still gripping the bat like a lifeline to his sanity. Oliver was still breathing, still alive, still dangerous. And in that moment, Damon made the second decision that would haunt him forever. He couldn't let Oliver live to hurt his mother, or any other mother, ever again. He finished what he'd started. What do you do when love requires you to become a monster? Cleaning up a murder scene is nothing like they show in movies. There's no dramatic music, no clever montage of efficient disposal. There's just the terrible weight of what you've done and the sick knowledge that every decision you make from that moment forward will either save you or damn you. Damon wrapped Oliver's body in the tarp Oliver himself had stored for monsoon season. The irony wasn't lost on him, even in his state of shock. Then, like some bitter twist of fate, he dragged the man who'd planned to murder his mother outside to the base of the mesquite tree where that fake wedding had taken place. He chose that spot for a reason, because it was where lies had been spoken, where false promises had been made, where his mother had given her heart to a killer. He dug by moonlight, hands blistering, sweat soaking his shirt despite the desert cold. The ground was harder than he'd expected, Arizona soil baked by decades of sun, reluctant to give up its secrets. It took hours, and with every scoop of earth, he told himself he was protecting his mother, saving her life, doing what any son would do. He didn't cry, not until the final scoop of dirt. Then he went inside, showered off the evidence, and climbed into his childhood bed like nothing had happened. Like he was still the same person he'd been 6 hours earlier, before love had turned him into a killer. But some things, once done, can never be undone. How do you comfort your mother for the loss of a man you killed to save her? The morning Oliver disappeared, Damon arrived at his mother's house to find her pacing the kitchen like a caged animal, cell phone pressed to her ear, calling Oliver's number over and over again. Each time it went to voicemail, she seemed to shrink a little more. He said he'd be back before noon, she kept repeating, as if saying it enough times would make it true. He never lies to me. The greatest lies, Damon thought, are the ones we tell ourselves. He held his mother while she cried, stroked her hair while she whispered Oliver's name like a prayer, and felt his heart break with every tear that fell for a man who'd never deserved them. Maybe he had an accident, Nadine whispered against his shoulder. Maybe he's hurt somewhere, waiting for help. I'm sure he's fine, Mom, Damon lied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. You know how men are with their hobbies. He probably lost track of time. But as the hours turned to days, and the days stretched into a week, even Damon's carefully constructed lies began to feel hollow. The police were asking questions he couldn't answer without revealing too much. His mother was growing more frantic, more desperate, more broken with each passing hour. And that's when Damon made his third fatal mistake. He hired a private investigator to find the man he'd already buried. What happens when the evidence you plant to protect someone you love ends up destroying them instead? Elizabeth Rogers was good at her job, too good as it turned out. Within days of Damon hiring her, she'd uncovered Oliver's aliases, his history of fraud, his trail of dead women. But she'd also uncovered something else, evidence that Oliver had never made it to the marina that morning. No security footage, no witness sightings, no boat rental records. Oliver Hayes had vanished from Nadine Jackson's house and never been seen again. Your mother's story doesn't add up, Rogers told Damon during their meeting at a coffee shop in Scottsdale, her voice low and professional. She says he left to go fishing, but there's no evidence he ever made it to the water. His fishing gear is still in the garage. Damon's blood ran cold. In his panic to create a cover story, he'd forgotten about the equipment Oliver had bought as part of his cover. Expensive rods and tackle that now sat untouched in the garage like silent witnesses to his lies. There's something else, Rogers continued. One of your mother's neighbors mentioned seeing someone digging in the backyard a few nights after Oliver disappeared. Thought it was strange, someone gardening at midnight. Damon felt the world tilt around him. Mr. Rhodes, the old Vietnam vet who walked his dog at all hours, who noticed everything from his front porch perch, who'd probably seen more than he'd admitted. I think you should prepare yourself, Rogers said gently. This isn't going to end with Oliver walking back through your mother's front door. She was right, but not in the way she thought. Sometimes the truth has a way of clawing its way to the surface, no matter how deep you bury it. Damon didn't wait for Rogers to contact the police. He couldn't. Every day that passed was another day his mother lived in hope. Another day she suffered for a man who'd planned to kill her. Another day the lie grew heavier on his conscience. He called the police himself, reported the neighbors' suspicions, played the part of the concerned son who just wanted answers. He watched the squad cars roll into his mother's cul-de-sac, watched the crime scene tape go up around the home, where he'd learned to ride a bike and caught fireflies and believed his mother could fix anything. He watched them dig up the tree where his parents used to push him on a tire swing. When they found Oliver's body, wrapped in blue tarp and tied with nylon rope, Damon felt something break inside his chest. Not regret, exactly, but a kind of terrible finality. There was no going back now. No more lies to tell, no more stories to maintain. Just the truth, waiting to surface like a body in still water. Nadine collapsed when she saw the body bag being zipped closed. The sight of his mother's genuine shock, her authentic grief for a man who'd planned to murder her, was almost more than Damon could bear. She really had loved Oliver in her way. She'd believed in the fairy tale, trusted in the possibility of second chances, opened her heart to a monster because she'd been starved for affection for so long. And that love, that beautiful, naive, hopeful love, had been the thing that saved her life, even though she'd never know it. How do you watch your mother be arrested for a crime you committed? Nadine was arrested that same evening, charged with second-degree murder, concealment of a corpse, and obstruction of justice. The 64-year-old woman was led out of her own home in handcuffs as news cameras flashed and neighbors whispered behind their curtains. Her mugshot, stunned, pale, hollow, spread across social media like wildfire. Local news stations picked up the story. Lonely widow kills much younger husband. The headlines painted her as everything from a black widow to a victim of elder abuse, but none of them came close to the truth. The truth was buried in a desert garden, along with the man who deserved to die. Damon couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't look at himself in the mirror without seeing his mother's face in that mugshot, confused and heartbroken and carrying the weight of his sins. He visited her at the county jail, sat across from her in a sterile room that smelled of industrial cleaner and broken dreams. "I didn't kill him," she whispered through the scratched glass that separated them. "Damon, I swear to you, I didn't even know he was dead. I thought he'd run away." The pain in her voice was unbearable. Not just grief for Oliver, but confusion at finding herself in a nightmare she couldn't understand. She looked smaller than he'd ever seen her, diminished by orange fabric and fluorescent lights, and the terrible weight of being accused of something she hadn't done. "I know, Mom," he said, and meant it. "I know you didn't." But knowing and proving were two different things, and every day she spent behind bars was another day Damon's conscience ate him alive. Sometimes love means destroying yourself to save someone else. 3 days after his mother's arrest, Damon walked into the Phoenix Police Department with trembling hands and asked to speak to Detective Sarah Bennett. The same detective who'd been building a case against Oliver for 2 years, who'd recruited his mother as an undercover operative, who'd watched her family implode because of a love that was supposed to save lives. Alone in the interview room, surrounded by concrete walls and fluorescent lights that made everything look dead, Damon confessed to everything. "I killed Oliver Hayes," he said, his voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside his chest. "My mother had nothing to do with it. She's innocent." Detective Bennett's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, relief, something that might have been respect. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because watching her suffer for something I did is worse than any prison sentence you could give me." The story came out in pieces. Oliver's phone call, the threat to Nadine's life, the moment Damon had realized his mother was marked for death. He told them about the baseball bat, about wrapping the body, about digging the grave under the tree where lies had been spoken and false promises made. "I never meant for her to be blamed," he said. "I thought the story about the boat would hold. I thought he'd just disappear, and she could grieve and move on. I never wanted her to go through this." "But you wanted Oliver dead," Detective Bennett said. Damon met her eyes without flinching. "Yes, and I'm not sorry. He was going to kill her. Maybe not that night, maybe not that week, but he was planning her murder. I heard him say it. So you decided to play judge, jury, and executioner." "I decided to protect my mother. If that makes me a monster, then I guess that's what love turned me into. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming, not even Damon. Your mother wasn't Oliver's victim, Mr. Jackson," Detective Bennett said, opening a thick file that had been sitting on the table between them. "She was our bait." The words hit Damon like a physical blow. The room seemed to spin around him, everything he thought he knew suddenly rearranging itself into a pattern he couldn't recognize. "What? Your mother came to us 6 months ago. She'd been contacted by one of Oliver's previous victims, a woman who suspected he was targeting her next. We recruited your mother to help us catch him in the act." Detective Bennett opened the file, revealing months of surveillance photos, audio transcripts, carefully documented evidence. Every conversation with Oliver was recorded. Every document he forged was cataloged. Every financial transaction was monitored. We had enough evidence to put him away for life. The room felt like it was closing in on him. "Your mother was never in any real danger," Bennett continued. "Oliver would have been arrested the morning after his supposed fishing trip. The phone call you overheard, where he talked about her being dead by the weekend, that was him talking to one of our undercover agents, trying to set up what he thought was a hired killer." Damon felt like he was drowning in air. "You killed a man who was already caught, Mr. Jackson. A man who was hours away from spending the rest of his life in prison." The silence that followed was deafening. All those months of watching his mother fall in love, of trying to protect her from a man she was helping to trap, of agonizing over her safety, while she was working with law enforcement to save other women's lives. She knew. His voice was barely a whisper. "Your mother has been one of the bravest women I've ever worked with. She put herself in danger for months to help us catch a serial killer. She saved lives, Mr. Jackson, and you destroyed everything she worked for." And in that moment, Damon realized that love, the kind of fierce, protective love that had driven him to murder, had just destroyed everything his mother had sacrificed to achieve. How do you tell your mother that her courage meant nothing because you couldn't trust her to protect herself? They brought Nadine to a small conference room adjacent to the interview area. When she saw Damon in handcuffs, her face went through the same emotional earthquake he'd experienced. Confusion, realization, heartbreak, and finally, a terrible kind of understanding. "Oh, love," she whispered, reaching toward him before remembering she couldn't touch. "I'm so sorry. This is all my fault." The pain in her voice was unbearable, but it was different now. Not the pain of a woman mourning a lost love, but the pain of a mother watching her child pay the price for trying to protect her. "No, Mom," Damon said, his voice steady for the first time in days. "It's not your fault. None of it was your fault." He looked at the woman who had raised him, protected him, loved him unconditionally his entire life, who had been brave enough to work undercover with police, who had put herself in danger to save strangers, who had carried the weight of his secrets without knowing they existed. "I know about the investigation," he said quietly. "I know you were working with the police. I know Oliver was going to be arrested anyway." Nadine's eyes filled with tears, not of grief now, but of pride mixed with heartbreak. "How did you?" "I killed him, Mom. I killed Oliver Hayes. And I'm going to confess, and you're going to go home and live your life and never apologize for my choices again." For the first time since this nightmare began, Nadine Jackson looked like what she truly was, a hero who'd helped catch a killer, not a victim who'd fallen for his lies. "I should have told you," she said, her voice breaking. "I wanted to, but they said it was safer if—" "You couldn't," Damon interrupted. "I understand that now. But Mom, I need you to understand something too." He leaned forward as much as his restraints would allow. "I'm not sorry I killed him. Oliver Hayes was planning to murder you, and even if you were working with police, even if you would have been arrested, in that moment, I thought you were in danger, and I acted to protect you. I'll serve my time, but I won't apologize for loving you that much. Some stories don't have happy endings. They have true endings."
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
The trial lasted 6 weeks, but the verdict was decided the moment Damon pled guilty to voluntary manslaughter. He accepted responsibility for Oliver Hayes' death while maintaining that he'd acted to protect his mother from a perceived threat. The prosecution painted him as a vigilante who'd taken the law into his own hands. The defense painted him as a son who'd acted out of love and desperation when he believed his mother's life was in danger. Nadine's testimony was the most powerful moment of the entire trial. She sat in the witness box in a navy blue dress, her hands folded in her lap, and told the story of a son who had always protected her, who had discovered what he believed was a plot to murder his mother and had acted on instinct to save the woman who had raised him. Damon never meant to hurt anyone, she said, tears streaming down her face but her voice never wavering. He was just trying to save his mom from what he thought was a dangerous man. If that makes him a criminal, then I suppose love is a crime. But she also told them about Oliver Hayes, about the women he'd killed, the lives he'd destroyed, the families he'd shattered in his wake. My son killed a monster, she said quietly. That doesn't make what he did legal, but it makes it understandable. Detective Bennett took the stand on the final day of testimony. She laid out the entire undercover operation, Oliver's history of violence, and the evidence they'd gathered about his plans. While Mr. Jackson's actions were illegal and tragic, she said, it's important to understand that Oliver Hayes was a serial killer. Mr. Jackson believed his mother was in imminent danger. His assessment was incorrect. We had the situation under control, but his fear for his mother's life was entirely reasonable given what he'd overheard. The jury deliberated for 18 hours before reaching their verdict. On the charge of voluntary manslaughter in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. The judge's sentencing was swift but merciful. Mr. Jackson, this court recognizes that you acted out of love and fear for your mother's safety. While your actions were illegal and cannot be excused, the circumstances surrounding this case are extraordinary. Taking into account your guilty plea, your lack of prior criminal history, and the unique circumstances of this case, I sentence you to 8 years in prison, with the possibility of parole in 5. It was less time than anyone had expected, but still a lifetime for a family already torn apart by love and violence. 5 years later, Nadine Jackson still lived in a modest apartment across town, having sold the house where Oliver was buried and where her son had become a killer to protect her. She'd used part of the money to start a foundation for victims of romance scams, turning her pain into purpose, her experience into expertise. The apartment was small but comfortable, filled with photos of her children and grandchildren, books about desert gardening, and letters from women across the country who'd found the courage to leave dangerous relationships because of her advocacy work. She'd had the mesquite tree removed and donated to a botanical garden where it could grow in peace without the weight of buried secrets. She never remarried, never dated, never even entertained the possibility of romance again. How could she? How could she trust her own judgment after everything that had happened? But more than that, how could she risk another son feeling the need to protect her from her own choices? Love, she'd learned, could be the most dangerous force in the world. Damon called her every Sunday from Arizona State Prison in Florence, and she visited him once a month, bringing homemade cookies and news from home. They never talked about Oliver Hayes directly, but his ghost haunted every conversation. In the things they didn't say, in the careful way they avoided certain topics, in the weight of shared secrets that had bound them together in ways that went beyond normal family love. "I'm proud of you," Nadine would say at the end of every visit, and she meant it. Proud of his education program, his work with other inmates, his plans for when he got out. But mostly proud that he'd finally learned to let truth guide his actions instead of fear. And Damon would nod and smile and feel grateful that the right thing, finally telling the truth, had set them both free, even if freedom looked different than either of them had imagined. Sometimes, late at night, Nadine would open a small wooden box from the back of her bedroom closet. Inside was the wedding ring Oliver had given her, simple white gold inscribed with the words, "Forever begins now." She would stare at it for a long time, not with anger or even sorrow, but with a strange kind of acceptance that some things in life don't make sense no matter how long you try to understand them. Oliver had been right about one thing. Forever had begun that night under the mesquite tree. Just not the way he'd planned. The ring had become her reminder, not of lost love, but of survival. Not of what she'd lost, but of what she'd helped save. She would think about Margaret Thornfield, the woman in Denver who hadn't been as lucky. About the 4 other wives who'd been left broken and dead. About all the women who might have been targeted if Oliver had lived to continue his hunting. And she would feel something that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite satisfaction, justice maybe. Or just the complicated peace that comes from knowing that sometimes the world is safer because someone you love became someone they never wanted to be. Then she would close the box, turn out the light, and whisper to the darkness, "I don't regret protecting others. I only regret that protection sometimes requires sacrificing the people we love most." 8 years after Oliver Hayes was buried under the mesquite tree in Nadine Jackson's backyard, Damon walked out of Arizona State Prison a free man. He was thinner than he'd been when he went in, grayer, with lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and hard-won wisdom. But when he saw his mother waiting for him in the prison parking lot, Her hair silver now, but her smile exactly the same. He felt like the boy who used to help her plant desert roses in their backyard garden. They didn't speak for the first few minutes. They just held each other. Two people who had paid the highest price for love and discovered it was worth every sacrifice. "I'm proud of you," Nadine whispered into her son's shoulder. "You did your time with dignity. Your father would be proud too." Damon pulled back to look at his mother's face, noting the new lines but also the strength that had always been there, the courage he'd never fully appreciated until it was too late to protect it. "What about you, Mom? Are you proud?" Nadine cupped his face in her hands, the same way she had when he was small and needed comfort. "I've been proud of you every day of your life, love. Even the hardest days. Especially the hardest days. Because they taught you who you really are." They drove home through the familiar streets of Phoenix, past the church where Nadine now volunteered with other victims of domestic violence, past the community center where she spoke to seniors about online dating safety, past all the places where their old life had existed before love and loss and terrible choices had changed everything. Her apartment was smaller than Damon remembered, but it felt like home in ways their old house never had after Oliver's death. "I kept some of your things," Nadine said, watching her son's face carefully. "I know you're a grown man with your own life to rebuild, but I hoped you might want to stay for a while, until you figure out what comes next." Damon smiled, the first real smile he'd worn in 8 years. "I'd like that, Mom. I'd like that very much." That night, as they sat together in the small living room, sharing stories and catching up on 8 years of careful distance, the local news ran a story about financial crimes against the elderly. The reporter interviewed Detective Sarah Bennett, now retired, about the importance of family communication in protecting vulnerable relatives. "Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones best positioned to spot the warning signs," she said to the camera. "But we also have to remember that love makes people do extraordinary things. Sometimes heroic things, sometimes terrible things. The key is making sure that love is guided by wisdom and trust, not just instinct and fear." Nadine reached for the remote and turned off the television. "Do you ever wonder," Damon asked quietly, "what would have happened if I hadn't killed him? If the police had arrested him the next morning like they planned?" Nadine was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the desert landscape she'd learned to love again. "I wonder about a lot of things," she said finally. "But I don't regret anything that kept families safe. Not the undercover work, not your choices, not the consequences we've both lived with. Oliver Hayes was a killer, love. He would have found a way to hurt someone somewhere. You made sure he couldn't. Even though it cost you 8 years of your life?" "Even though," Nadine said firmly. "Because those 8 years meant other mothers got to keep their sons. They meant other women got to grow old safely. They meant justice was served, even if it wasn't the justice anyone expected." She reached over and took her son's hand, older now, marked by years of hard work and harder choices, but still the hand that had built sandcastles and caught fireflies and learned to be gentle with small things. "I learned something important during all this, Damon. I learned that love isn't always gentle. Sometimes love has teeth. Sometimes love requires sacrifice. Sometimes love means making choices that change you forever. And you're okay with that?" Nadine smiled, and for the first time in years, it reached her eyes completely. "I'm more than okay with it, love. I'm grateful for it, because it means I raised a child who would do anything to protect the people he loves. And in a world full of people like Oliver Hayes, that's exactly the kind of person the world needs." Outside, the desert wind rustled through the small courtyard garden where Nadine had planted new roses, not to replace what was lost, but to celebrate what had survived. Years later, when journalists asked about the case, when criminologists studied it in their textbooks, when families used it as a cautionary tale about trust and deception, they would miss the most important part of the story. This wasn't really a story about a con man who targeted vulnerable women, though Oliver Hayes was certainly that. It wasn't even a story about a mother and son who protected each other at terrible cost, though they certainly did. This was a story about a family that discovered that love, real love, protective love, sacrificial love, sometimes requires you to become someone you never thought you could be. Sometimes it requires you to work undercover with police to catch a killer, risking your life to save strangers. Sometimes it requires you to make choices that define you forever, accepting consequences that will follow you to your grave. Sometimes it requires you to take a life to save the people you love, knowing that salvation might cost you everything. And sometimes, the people who love you most are the ones who will carry your darkest secrets to their graves, not because they approve of what you've done, but because they understand why you had to do it. Oliver Hayes had been wrong about one thing. Forever doesn't begin with marriage vows or romantic promises or rings inscribed with pretty lies. Forever begins the moment you realize you would do anything, absolutely anything, to protect the people you love. Even if it destroys you, even if it costs you everything, even if no one else will ever understand. The Jackson family had learned that lesson in the most brutal way possible. But they had also learned something else, that the strongest bonds are forged not in happiness, but in shared sacrifice. Not in joy, but in mutual understanding of what love actually costs. Not in perfection, but in the willingness to be imperfect for each other. And that kind of love, complicated, dangerous, uncompromising, tested by fire and proven by sacrifice, really does last forever. Even when forever is shorter than you hoped it would be. Even when it's longer than you thought you could survive. Even when it looks nothing like the fairy tale you thought you were writing. The desert keeps its secrets, but the human heart keeps its love. And sometimes, that's the only forever that matters. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the lengths we'll go to for family, if it challenged your ideas about justice and love and the choices that define us, then you understand that some truths are too complex for simple answers. This wasn't just another true crime story. This was a deep dive into the human heart at its most desperate and devoted. This was about the moral complexities that real families face when love collides with law, when protection demands sacrifice, when the people we care about most are threatened by forces beyond our control. Because in the end, we're all just one phone call away from becoming someone we never thought we could be. All one crisis away from discovering what we're really capable of. All one moment away from learning what love actually costs. And sometimes that cost is everything.